This is an interview with Chris McDermott, Anglican priest, Zen Buddhist, and Lead Chaplain at the University of Sussex. He has a background in conflict mediation, having spent his early working years teaching in a segregated school during apartheid in South Africa. During our conversation, we talked about his experiences resolving interpersonal disputes, stories from the countries he's lived in, and how he maintains dual faiths in the modern world. Chris is warm, kind, down-to-earth, and humble, and works every day on campus in the meeting house, leading meditations and listening to students. It was a pleasure to speak with him, and I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Hi Chris, thanks very much for joining. So I'm wondering if you can give a quick overview of some of the interesting things you've done with your life, perhaps some of the things that we've spoken about in the past, and then ending with how you ended up taking your position here at Sussex.
Okay, will do, yes. As you can gather from my accent, I'm not British originally. I'm from Niagara Falls, New York. That's where I was born, where I grew up, and where I spent the first roughly 18 years of my life before going off to study theology and ministry and such subjects in New England. But a key transition that I made in the course of my journey was to leave the country in 1976 and go work in Zimbabwe. It was Rhodesia at that time. I was there during the Bush War. And I was working in adult education, training ministers for the African churches in that country. So I was very much working with the black community. Was there for about a year and a half, just a bit longer. Went back to the States briefly, pastored a church in an impoverished area of the Pittsburgh region during a bit of recession in that part of the world. And then returned to Southern Africa, this time to live in South Africa, again working with African communities, initially in Pretoria and then in Durban. And it was in South Africa that a lot of my journey that brought me to this place took shape. I became very much interested in conflict resolution work, for example. It was during the height of apartheid in South Africa, so the divisions there were quite poignant. A passion for justice, took hold at that point, and after 3.5 years of working in South Africa, I went back to the States, did some further academic work, ended up doing some applied anthropology and cross-cultural studies in the Chicago area, a post-grad degree, and then came to England in 1987, and I've lived here since. So I've been close to 35 years living in this country. I'm a dual national at this stage, British, American, and I've spent 27 of those years in East London. Again, working in churches initially as a free church minister in an ecumenical partnership, and then as an Anglican priest in Ilford. While doing all of that, I had gotten involved in neighborhood and community mediation work in the East End. So I did a lot of work around conflict resolution, neighborhood mediation, working with young people, especially in the streets of Newham. Some of them doing specific work around learning conflict resolution skills. For a lot of that time, training young people as peer mediators, peer peace builders, and facilitators to work with their peers and their local community. And eventually, the job at Sussex was advertised, and because the charity I'd been working with had pretty much been impacted by the economic downturn, and after 2008, I was no longer in work, and I saw this advertisement for a chaplaincy role at the University of Sussex, and I thought, this looks right. And so I came here in very early 2014. I've been here going on 9 years now.
Oh, brilliant. So do you think you could share a little bit more about your experience now you've been at Sussex, perhaps what's taken you about the community and the style here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Sussex and the Brighton area in general is very diverse, but it's diverse in a different way than what Newham was in East London. It's got a different kind of feel about it, you might say, and I do love it. I've enjoyed and loved living in Brighton, and I've enjoyed immensely the diversity and engagement here at the University of Sussex. As the lead chaplain, I've had the privilege of connecting to a wide range of people on campus, both students and members of staff, working alongside people in pastoral context, supporting students and members of staff when they face loss or when they've hit snags in their life journeys and wanted to talk about the stuff that is going down for them. But interesting, a lot of my work in Sussex is also involved conflict resolution work. Because I'm a qualified workplace mediator in my background, often I've been invited in to support members of staff who are having difficulties with their relationships, and sometimes this has meant facilitating conversations between people as we journey toward some kind of reconciliation and some more positive way of working together.
Okay, so it sounds as though conflict resolution is something that's been a running theme somewhat over the course of your life, beginning with your time in Rhodesia as an Anglican priest. So I'm wondering if you can perhaps start by sharing a story of something that has happened, an experience with conflict resolution at your time there.
Yeah, well, what has struck me is the power of people telling their stories, and the power there is in people hearing one another's stories as though for the first time. And there have been a number of instances that have impressed that lesson upon me, but in just a random situation, I was once called with a co-mediator to facilitate a conversation between two neighbours living on an estate in North London for the Peabody Trust, which was an affordable housing trust. And these neighbours had fallen out big time, and it was creating a serious issue on the estate. And unusually, given the way we work, where people freely choose to come to mediation. In this instance, the neighbors didn't exactly freely choose to come to mediation, as being more or less threatened with being expelled from the estate if they didn't throw this business out. Anyway, so whereas we normally visit neighbors individually, and then arrange some sort of meeting to come together, everything happened in one fell swoop. We met up with the neighbors at Peabody's offices in South London, initially talking to them individually, meeting with them just for a bit of time before the joint meeting. And the atmosphere was just thick with contempt, with anger, with hate, if that's not too strong a word, towards each other, and it all revolved around an issue of noise, and that was the nub of it. But it had created this hostility between them. It was incredible, but we got them together, and as we began the session, their body language was very eloquent. Arms folded, not even wanting to look at each other, looking really uncomfortable about being there. It was again, the atmosphere was thick with the tension. And then, the first neighbor was invited to just tell what has been going on for them. And they gave a bit of background about the conflict, about how it was impacting on them. And under the ground rules that we set, of course, people listen without interrupting each other. And so as one person began to tell their story, there were mild shifts in the atmosphere. And the other person began to tell their side of the story. And again, the atmosphere became just a bit less tense as they were talking. Initially, they were asked to talk to us rather than to each other. But eventually we let that rule slip as they just suddenly naturally slid into this conversation with each other, each one discovering things that they hadn't realized about the other person's story and how this stuff was really affecting them, and the difficulty the younger neighbor had in being a single mom raising children in this relatively small flat, and they just began talking to each other. The atmosphere eased, and eventually they came to an amicable arrangement how they would tended some ideas and strategies for how they would deal with this in the future. And it felt so genuine at the end that they shook hands, and they decided to share a cab back to the estate, and they went home together in a cab. And it was a lovely ending to that, but it didn't even end there. A few months later, one of the managers from Peabody Trust, who happened to be on the management committee of Conflict and Change, the organization that I worked with at the time, had come by the offices of Conflict and Change and said, "Oh, by the way, you know that those two ladies that you did the mediation for a few months ago?" I said, "Yeah." Well, the one neighbor's husband, who was only in his 40s, just suddenly dropped dead. He was a cabbie in North London, and her mainstay of support has been that neighbor, and they become very close over over that period after the mediation, and certainly this event of tragic loss kind of just cemented the relationship and made it really solid. So that was kind of like a textbook ending. But I look at that story and I realize how powerful it was for them to actually, in a structured situation, to kind of hear each other's stories and respond to each other's stories in a way that they weren't able to do shouting at each other outside their flats. But anyway, that's one incident.
Thank you.
I may have belabored that.
No, that's a really beautiful, poignant story. That's that's really, really wonderful to hear a situation start off as tense as that, and then resolve simply through communication, through people talking to one another about how they feel in a way which is I guess detailed and not afraid to say what you think.
Yeah, so, and the role of the facilitators in that situation is to kind of translate what we're hearing, to make sure that the other person actually hears the essential feelings and needs that are coming across, rather than any blame language or accusations that may be implicit in the way we tell our stories sometimes.
Absolutely.
But another we worked with trained volunteers as mediators in that project. And what was interesting, more than 2 or 3 of those volunteers were people who themselves had been neighbors in dispute and had come across the project through their work with these neighbors, and they were so taken by this process through which they had been reconnected with their neighbor that they came forward as volunteers to be trained as community mediators. And so people were bringing that experience of having had disputes with neighbors to that work of conciliation.
That's brilliant. It's very promising to hear people that have had that experiences like that realize how important it is to come forward and help other people in that kind of situation. I think it's something as well with conflict resolution that perhaps if you haven't had the experience struggling yourself, it can be hard to imagine how other people can be so affected by situations like that. I think that was the thinking behind using local neighbors as mediators. These are people who lived in the community, who knew the community, and were able to engage with the community. That's excellent stuff. So let's move on to something which is another very interesting characteristic. We can see in front of you, we've got on this shelf what looks like a sort of Renaissance era image.
Well, no, actually, it's an icon, an old Greek Russian icon, a Trublev's Hospitality of Abraham, but it represents the Trinity.
Okay.
But it goes back. Kind of maybe early medieval times, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be. But
medieval Christian image, and then above a more Buddhist seeming
Buddha. Yes.
seeming image as well. Can you explain what's going on here?
Well, you'd think they might be neighbors in dispute, but they're not. No, and as you know, I mean, I'm an Anglican priest, and I've been an Anglican priest since '96, and I grew up as a Christian. But back in the '90s, I began to discover some positive energy in Buddhist practice, and I began attending a Buddhist center in Bethnal Green, then eventually started attending a Zen dojo in North London as well. But I began to find the philosophy, the thinking, and the practice of Buddhism very commodious in lots of ways, but and on the face, to some extent, in conflict with Christianity, because Buddhism, doesn't talk about a god. In fact, it's quite atheist, if I can put it that way. Whereas Christianity classically is thought of in terms of theist, believing in this entity called God. But I'm aware that tension is more at the level of how we conceptualize those faiths. There is a rich tradition in Christian spirituality that is non-theist in nature in terms of its understanding of the ultimate and of God and of reality, and which resonates quite well with the Buddhist notion of shunyata and emptiness. And that, in fact, I eventually formally received Jukai in a Zen tradition, which is I've taken refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha in a formal ceremony, and doing so without actually stopping being a Christian. They both came to flow together for me. They flow together in my practice, my thinking, which isn't to say there isn't areas where we need to think about those tensions and inhabit those tensions creatively. And so I'm doing it at the moment by way of a PhD research project looking at this experience of dual Buddhist Christian belonging, which has become quite common. You'll find Jesuit priests, for example, who are qualified Zen masters, Christians of various sorts, Catholic, non-Catholic, men, women, lay people, who are finding that dual belonging is actually a part of their lives. They're Buddhist, they're Christian, not in any superficial sense, but they've taken formal steps to connect to both traditions and are involved in church communities, but also involved in sanghas as well. So I emphasize that, lest we kind of confuse it with some sort of New Age fad, where I'm a Buddhist, I'm everything, dude. It's not that. It's actually there's some considered decisions around engagement with both those communities.
Yeah, I think to pick up on that last part, I think perhaps to some people it might be more or less familiar, the idea of having multiple faiths at the same time. So do you think you could go into a little bit more detail about perhaps some points of conflict that people might observe, some ways that you've had to sort of perhaps massage the two faiths together to interpret both?
Recently, for example, it wasn't my story, but someone else's story about they were talking about being a dual belonger at a local sangha with the Triratna tradition, and I've come across this too within the Triratna community, which, by the way, is where I began my formal kind of introduction to Buddhist practices. And
what's the Triratna community?
Triratna, it used to be Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. They've changed it. It's a very much a modern English based, or if you're in America, American. It's one of those species of Buddhism that have kind of become part of the West, as it were. So But someone was just going on about how it's impossible to be a Buddhist and a Christian. Christians believe in God. Buddhists don't believe in God, which is true. Which is completely true, but it's also completely true at the level of where we conceptualize our faith and in their difference. But in both Christianity and in Buddhism, those concepts that we work with are not absolutized. They're, again, to use a Zen phrase, they're fingers pointing at the moon. They're indicative of some reality that eschews language and thoughts capacity to engage with. In Buddhism, the emptiness is the kind of word for that ultimate reality in nirvana. In Christianity, we sometimes talk about it in terms of this cloud of unknowing. The author of a medieval text, actually maybe even early Renaissance, 14th century anyway, early 14th century text called The Cloud of Unknowing, which has an honorable place, by the way, in English literature, as one of the first Old English texts to come to the fore. But in that book, the anonymous writer talks about God in terms of this cloud of unknowing. And he uses the language runs something like this: God can be got by thought, never. Never by thought, never by words, never by concepts, but by love alone. And so it is a way of thinking theism that is very non-theistic. This this holy mystery that we engage with, but not at this level of concepts where the Buddhist concepts, the Christian, they are radically different. They're expressed in different cultural forms and out of different historical, cultural, and world contexts. But the reality toward which they point is something that quite escapes our capacity to conceptualize. And I think that's where many people who would describe themselves as dual belongers will fit in that engagement with mystery that is not able to be captured in words. So I may have gone astray from your question, actually.
Well, no, that's a brilliant answer. Thank you very much.
So that's kind of where but nonetheless, that doesn't constitute a there. See, done. It doesn't at all, and I don't believe there are still kind of, I think, tensions and emphases and in the way we use language to talk about these different experiences, and I think part of that experience of dual belonging is a willingness to kind of sit with the tension without rushing to some kind of glib closure that explains it all. And that's probably true of life. And
I think this runs well with the conflict resolution background as well, I suppose.
Yeah, it does. And actually, I find that sitting with these two faith traditions in this, one body, one experience, actually does resonate as I'm sitting with people listening to stories. And sometimes you reach a point where, you don't know what to do. Then I realize I don't have to do anything. An impasse has been reached at this moment. People can't get past this particular point or that particular issue, and we're kind of stuck there. The temptation is to rush into that as the mediator with a possible solution to kind of bring closure. But that, when we do that, that's more about my discomfort than about what is actually needed in that situation. And I found that the culture of silence that is often part of the practice, especially in my Zen tradition, actually sits well. It's not lazy silence. It's not escapist silence, but you deliberately sit with this tension. You are enabling other people to sit with that tension, and you're very careful about what you say next, unless it be by way of simply highlighting that this is where we are, where can we go with it, and you keep the ball in their court, and very often suddenly that impasse becomes something different. Something else emerges. Sometimes that happens after the actual mediation. In one situation, which I won't go into detail, but it was actually here. This is not the only place that's happened. We've reached an impasse in the mediation. There's been some really fruitful dialogue, some really fruitful conversation. People have heard each other in a way they hadn't heard each other before. But here, this issue is still there. Can't get past that. Okay, we've ended on that note. Okay, we can't get past that. And for me, by the way, as a mediator, I don't see my job as to help you reach a solution. It's to support your conversation. It's to support you in communicating in ways you haven't been able to before. And sometimes that's all you can do. Very often that leads to a resolution. Sometimes it doesn't. But in this instance, as in other instances I can actually think of in the neighborhood mediation, these two went away, and eventually one of them invited the other person and their spouse to come by for a visit for dinner, because they had a previous history, of course, of friendship and connection, and so they came by, and they had a nice meal together, the four of them, the spouses, the participants in this conflict, and by the end of that evening, they had actually overcome that impasse. They made a decision was made by both of them. Okay, this is what we will do then. And there was an agreement on a really sticky issue. I'm being reluctant to just say anything about that issue because it is kind of local and close.
Oh, of course, yeah. Oh, well, fantastic.
But it was the power. It was the power of kind of actually engaging in a very different way that sometimes bears fruits after a formal, facilitated conversation.
Brilliant. I'm wondering now if you'd be able to comment at all on perhaps conflict in the sort of wider university space. So at the moment we're at the University of Sussex, and there is the way that people communicate. There's the students' union is set up to represent student views. They communicate with the university. There have been controversies, as there always are.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if you have some things to say about university spaces generally, or any specific recent events.
I mean, one thing I want to say, what's admirable is the passion that people bring to questions around what is just, what is right, what is kind, what is compassionate. And I would dearly love to see that passion expressed in a way that honors the diversity of views and opinions. And of course, when I say honor the diversity of views and opinions, I think naturally excluding those views that are inherently hateful. And so now at least not in any kind of public forum. I don't want to be inviting, bring your fascism, let's engage. No, that's not what I'm talking about. But we're really quick to label things fascist, or this or that, homophobic, racist, and actually that's not necessarily the case. We're responding out of our own sense of passion, justice perhaps, but we're not really listening to where someone else might be coming from. And cancellation culture, I think, it's a tragedy, and it's it is counter to everything that I think an academic institution should just be about, where we discuss ideas, even those ideas that make me uncomfortable or make you uncomfortable. Let's talk about them. Tell me why you think this way. And kind of be able to sit with those tensions, sit with the differences, but in a way I don't rush to a premature judgment. Well, you're just racist. You're homophobic. You're transphobic. Listen. Be uncomfortable. Be with your own uncomfort. Be with the discomfort of the situation. Sometimes you have to sit with that for quite a while. That's why Gillian Rose's work is so important to me. Her take on the broken middle, and the capacities that involves if you're going to really truly engage with the other. You're there to listen. You're also there to communicate. your thinking. You sit with patience. You deliberately avoid rushing to judgment, rushing to some premature closure. And sometimes that is really hard when all you can do is sit for the time being with that tension, that difference. But the capacity to be able to do so is itself transformative. It enhances, our respect, our regard for one another, and our ability to kind of live with difference in the most positive sense of the word. And it'd be great to kind of create spaces, conscientious spaces around the university where that can happen.
Yeah, that's a very thorough answer. That's thank you very much for the passion as well. It's good to hear that.
That's okay. I get excited by microphones.
So I'm wondering now if we can move back onto what you talked about at the start, about your time in Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, as well as in apartheid South Africa as well. Because this was, as you were saying, a lot earlier in your life. So if you could perhaps some foundational experiences here that kind of moved you in the conflict resolution direction.
I have to say, when I lived in Zimbabwe from 76 through 78, just over a year and a half, 19 months or so there. And it was a time in my own journey where I had moved from being, because I'd been raised a Roman Catholic, at one point was going to be a Franciscan friar, left that, found myself worshiping and working in an evangelical charismatic milieu, which invariably in those days and still today in America carries with it a lot of conservative baggage in terms of political thinking. So I went to Zimbabwe. It was very much as a conservative Christian, and when I was there, I became aware of that. I was very uncomfortable with my then father-in-law's take on the local African community. He had been a missionary there since 1939. So my then wife, with whom I'm still great friends, I have to say, it was very uncomfortable because he had these very colonial, very negative takes on the local African Christians, and that was kind of unsettling and uncomfortable. But I was still just embedded in this kind of conservatism that was unlikely to raise strong, vehement challenges. Left there, where I was teaching in an African college. Eventually came back to South Africa, but it was very different there. I was again immediately involved in a community affected even more so than in Zimbabwe by this rigid segregation of communities and the formal policy of apartheid, which actually before it was a political tool was a theological doctrine.
Right.
It was just a bit of, if I may, before I move on, apartheid had become a dogma within the South African Reformed Church early on. It was based on a kind of distortion of certain Calvinist teachings. Like you found within certain Reformed circles this notion of sphere sovereignty, business, family, religion, economic, all these different spheres. The government's role was to coordinate relationships among these so that none were unduly interfering in the other. Abraham Kuyper, a Dutch theologian, gave a clear expression of that, but ironically his expression of it was in the context of a civil rights struggle for families to have access to religious education in Holland. And so it had a civil rights context. But conservative Reformed theologians in South Africa took on this notion of sphere sovereignty and applied it to race. Yeah, the sphere of the European white communities, African, Indian, colored. They had different spheres. People. So the whole political structure was built on this separation of people. But unlike original neo-Calvinist thinking, where the government's role was to, support the well-being of those different spheres, this was used as an excuse to take 87% of the land away from, and give it to 13% of the population, the best of the land, and to give 13% of the land to the other 87% of the population, the worst of it, and enforce this separation. It became an exploitative tool. It became formal political policy in 1948 with the triumph of the Nationalist Party. So anyway, this is the context in which I'm living, the mindset in which I'm surrounded. Working with the Black community by and large, and it was the working with the Black community that I think I began to experience a real shift. A move away from that conservative evangelical theology. I was impressed by what I was seeing in the Methodist Church, for example, in the Anglican Church in Southern Africa, where black and white ministers were being paid the same, where you actually had black leadership. Archbishop Tutu, head of the Church of the Province of South Africa, the president of the Methodist Conference was a black minister and theologian. But the churches were, kind of trying to work with a just ethic in terms of, how they lived, how they thought, and certainly were often on the receiving end of unwelcome attention by the apartheid regime because of their activities in the townships. But I began to move significantly, and my engagement with my students was very different. And I remember, actually, we had one textbook in the school in near Mansum Toti I was teaching in. It was a textbook produced by the church that I had been kind of employed by to do this teaching, and it was it was utter propagandist crap. Sorry, can I say crap?
That's okay.
In terms of its support for a white understanding of history in that part of the world. And I just said, I delivered, threw it aside, and said, no, we're gonna, and we kind of generated up our own material. And we're really engaging with stuff, but in a very different way than they had been, used to. The principal of the school, a gentleman, an Afrikaner gentleman, was very conservative and very traditionalist and very supportive of the apartheid regime as well. But that my engagement with my students has really had a big impact on me, on my thinking, politically, theologically, and it was an amazing experience. So I came back to the States after that, very changed, very transformed. I finished my some academic work at an evangelical institution, in fact, in Florida, but I was probably only a student in that institution who would have self-consciously described himself as socialist in his, in his views, and very Catholic in my kind of practice in lots of ways.
Well, perhaps we can move on to the more political side of things and see what socialism means to you in a moment. But I'm just to continue on the last point for a moment. I'm wondering if this ever got you into trouble. This sort of very very open attitude towards race, kind of going against the apartheid regime. Is this something that sort of brought you into conflict, into any difficult situations?
It brought me into some tensions with people. I mean, one day we were hosting a barbecue, for students from the school who came over to the house. I lived, of course, as one had to, in a white neighborhood, and I had all these African students, outside. We're in the front, with the rice places. We got some askance, looks from neighbors at that. I've never gotten any police trouble, I have to say, anything like that. I found myself in awkward situations walking with a friend through around Pretoria. Again, he was a student as well, a black student. So we're wondering where we can go somewhere to eat. But there's no place we can both go together. And so, I've got some sandwiches, so we sat out on a bench in the park. So it kind of created tensions and uncomfortable situations like that. But no, I'd never gotten into trouble with the police because of my activities or anything like that.
Okay.
So
that's good, because it could have been treading on thin ice. It's worked out well.
yeah, oh yes, yes, and yeah.
So to move on to some more of your kind of more the political side of things, I suppose. You mentioned being considered a socialist. I've also seen you walking around campus with a long black leather jacket as well. Sort of that's behind you as well. We can't see it on the camera. Yeah.
Yes.
So what are your views in that sort of area?
Well, on the latter point, I simply love long black coats. In fact, I even had a poem printed about a long black coat, and a collection of poetry I was here.
Okay.
But so that's just an aesthetic detail.
Okay.
I have a kind of gothic vibe in terms of how I enjoy dressing. But in terms of the socialism, I think when I describe myself as socialist, I don't mean it in any strict sense of I'm a socialist worker, remember? I think the ethos of socialism, that principle that I think the primary role of government is to ensure that the more vulnerable in society are taken care of, that basic things like education, transport, health care are supported by our taxes, and that the ethos of sharing love and compassion is at the heart of it. So I'm not necessarily tying my socialism to some specific Marxist analysis of stuff. It's more of an ethos that I'm more at home in than I am in kind of capitalist emphases on individualism and making profit. Though there may be a place within capitalism where that can be harnessed in a way that is for the public good. So, but in the end, I am more at home in a socialist kind of ethos of sharing and communal responsibility, and I'm happy to pay extra taxes to sustain the good of people.
Okay. So moving on then, picking up more on the love for love, so I've been saying. So you've alluded this as something, feeling for one another in communities and in conflict resolution, as well as in reference to feelings towards God and to the more sort of way you'd refer to it in Buddhism.
Yeah.
Is this I suppose I'm looking into the more spiritual kind of love at this point, because it's very easy to see. I suppose love is one of those emotions that it would seem impossible not to associate it with God or with higher being if you believe that there is something like that. So do you see these as being part of the same kind of spiritual love, pointing in the same direction?
Yeah, I think so, because at the heart of my understanding of all of this is that as human beings, we are essentially interconnected. That is who I am. Rather than I think, therefore I am, I would say we are, therefore I am. It's as more of a communal sense, and in Buddhism, actually, if you look, at certainly in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, the notion of emptiness doesn't mean that there's a void there, but it means that you, as Jethro, have no essential autonomous existence. I, as Chris, have no autonomous essential existence as such, but we interexist. Reality is interfused. Human beings with nature, with one another, with the cosmos, we are profoundly interconnected, and to me that's the form where love comes to the fore. And interestingly, in the Christian scriptures, the closest the writers come to giving a definition of God is John's words that God is love. That's where we encounter in those depths of love and those depths of our relationships with one another, that holy mystery that is God, that abyss that is the divine presence. It's not up there and not down there. It's kind of in this this mix of interrelated beings, sentient beings, nature. We encounter God there. Well, I've talked to you before about Paniker's notion of cosmotheandric reality.
Yes.
Where he brings together the notion of the cosmos, theos, God, and andros, humankind. We find God within that complex of cosmotheandric, reality, rather than as some separate datum over there. It's in this conversation, it's in this interaction, and that's where we encounter the divine. That's where we encounter the emptiness that is, us in the world.
So where does this then sit with religions further afield? So you're happy with having two faiths, but there are also many branches of Christianity besides Anglican. There are many different branches of Buddhism, and also religions that may or may not be related to those as well. How does this fit into the condotheandric, your own personal?
Yeah, I'm not saying, this is the way we should all be going. This is an experience that I have found, that works for me. I don't think that all Buddhists, all Christians should be dual belongers. That's not the point. The point is, this is a possibility in these instances, and we should mark it, and celebrate it rather than demonize it or anything like that. Let's look at it as an opportunity for a more profound dialogue, as well between traditions. Paniker, again, coming back to him, he famously described himself as a Catholic Hindu Buddhist, with profound roots in all of those traditions. It basically, maybe that experience is a sort of sign of possibility. At the very least, it provides some sort of energy for those conversations that can, link us across, immense gaps in thinking and experience and thought, and I think that it becomes a resource for building peace in the world, as a model for, thinking if you put that in quote parentheses, impossible. In other words, the possible impossibilities that are potentially available for us as we kind of move in that direction of a truly and profoundly peaceful community, rich in its diversity, yet somehow connecting to something deeply important across those differences.
Oh, brilliant. So on further to this then, how would you approach or communicate or share your perspective around someone that is firmly an atheist, someone that doesn't experience this the sense of love or something greater than themselves?
Okay, well, I think not all atheists don't experience something like that is bigger than themselves. They're just not going to use that language of God. And very often I have a lot in common with them, because I probably don't believe in the God they don't believe in either. And I think I want to connect with what makes people tick, whatever label they use of themselves. What is important to you then? What is it you value most deeply? And insofar as people know and encounter something that enables them to really value other human beings, to think it's important to pursue justice and pursue right, to be compassionate, even though I'm an atheist. That's cool. Because, at that depth, I think I would use, it might sound patronizing because it's me, I would say, well, that's where you encounter God. The God experience without God, basically, which I think is a total possibility. You could have God experience with or without God. But by that experience, I mean the experience of this deeper connection with life, with the world. which occasionally we experience, and everybody, I think, has moments like this, this flash of insight, this flash of, gosh, well-being, and sense of, oneness, with what's around us. And to me, that's an important theological experience, even if you're an atheist.
Yeah, it's a beautiful experience. I think it's certainly something that most, if not all, people seem to have capable inside them.
Yeah.
Just to perhaps drill into one of the points that you made there as well, the idea that you could have a God experience without committing to the idea that there is a God.
Yeah.
Would you say that there's this is somehow different from believing in the real God? Is there the real God? What does this mean? How is this different from just the feeling of there being one?
The real God. Again, that question. Real God is a loaded term,
of
frankly.
Course, yeah.
I think coming to this notion of belief, it's really interesting, because it was only since the 17th century that the notion of belief was intellectualized as a creed. The creed, we say the creed. I believe in the in Catholic tradition, certainly every Sunday I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. And you might go to the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, depending on the church. But and we think of that. Okay, here's my list of 6 impossible things to believe before breakfast. And it's not that. How that word was understood, creed was understood, prior to the 17th century or so, was, at a more emotive level. It comes from Cordeaux, I give my heart to. Not believe. I give my heart to this. And the statement of faith isn't so much about concepts that you embrace intellectually. It's this is the language, this is the mythos, this is the story that I give my heart to, without necessarily some preliminary judgment about the factuality of this one or that. This is the story, and I give my heart to it. What that story may mean may be different. Why it is possible, I might kind of regard some of that story as poetic expression. I might, regard it as myth. I might see it as existing among those things that are absolutely true. It's just they're not factual. So belief actually is less of an intellectual word than an orientation of the heart and of life. And to believe in Christ, for example, is not so much about subscribing to a creed as it is about doing what Christ does, loving the other, embracing the other. In the story of Saint Francis of Assisi, and I'm another part of my experience, by the way, I'm a third order Franciscan. But in the story of St. Francis, we find him going out and embracing the ugly, the repulsive, the leper, as a part of his commitment to embodying faith in Christ, faith doing, faith working for justice, faith struggling for peace, faith loving my enemy. If those things aren't a part of belief, I don't give a damn what you believe. That doesn't matter. And I think the drift of the New Testament is in the same direction. It's about what you do.
Brilliant.
How you live.
That's really well put. Thank you very much, Chris, for your conversation here today. Now I have one last question just to finish up. So this podcast is going to be sent out to students at the University of Sussex, people that are perhaps in the process of thinking about careers, or perhaps a little earlier than that, thinking about friends and relationships, and thinking in the more long term about adult life. I'm wondering if there are any perhaps words of wisdom or inspiration that you could give to offer people that are in our age at university.
Words of wisdom. We'll park that for a moment, but I think really it's important just to be available to what life may hold. You know, not to lock yourself into a concrete set of things that you expect to happen, because life takes sudden turns. But just to be at home with yourself, love other people. You know, let that experience of compassion toward the world around you be a key thing that orientates you. Do what you love if you can, but just know that even when things go awry and stuff happens that you don't expect to happen, or that kind of you didn't want to happen, that's not the end. It's perhaps the entree to another set of possibilities, you know, that are even more exciting than what you thought for yourself. You know, if you go to our graduation ceremonies, Sanjeev Bhaskar often talks about the fact that he's ended up as Chancellor of the University of Sussex, an institution that rejected him when he first applied as a student. and he tells the story. The point he's saying he wanted to make was that you don't know what life is going to bring your way. You know, I never expected to be here as Chancellor, but you know, here I am. And you know, where you are is where you are, and you know, just be open to the rich possibilities that your future has. Just do your best, but above all, allow compassion, love, a desire for a just world and community to be motivating factors in your life, and the rest I trust will by and large fall into place.
Okay. That's a brilliant note to finish on. Thank you very much, Chris, for being here today.
Thank you.